This Notebook LM video explores how the earliest Christian lived and worshipped, long before formal church buildings existed. Believers gathered in homes, creating intimate, house churches that emphasized fellowship and resilience under persecution. Christianity was not defined by architecture, but by radical community, devotion, and generosity.
Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever really stopped to think about what the very first Christian church was actually like? I'm not talking about the buildings we see today, but the original first-century gatherings. We're going to piece together the clues from history and scripture to find out.
Okay, so when I say the word church, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably a specific kind of building, right? Maybe it's got steeples, stained glass, pews, a very structured service. But what if I told you that for the first few hundred years of Christianity, that image, well, it just didn't exist at all?
The reality for those early believers was something radically different. It was so much less formal and way more personal. It really wasn't about a place you went to, it was a community you belonged to. And it all started in the most ordinary of places, someone's home.
So let's try and peel back those layers. Let's deconstruct our modern ideas of what church is. What did it actually look like before there were any church buildings? The answer, and it's a simple one, is the house church. For centuries, the center of Christian life wasn't some grand cathedral, but the living room of a fellow believer. Yeah, gatherings took place in the homes of members, usually the wealthier ones who just, had more space. This created this incredibly intimate, close-knit community right from the get-go.
But to really get a grip on how these house churches worked, we've got to look at their roots. We have to remember that this new faith didn't just appear out of nowhere, it grew directly out of Judaism.
I mean, you got to remember, Jesus and all his apostles, they were Jewish. So for them, this new faith wasn't some brand new religion. It was the fulfillment of their Jewish faith. So of course they continued their existing worship practices. They went to the synagogue, they read the scriptures, and they followed the traditions they'd known their entire lives.
But this is where we see something new and distinct start to emerge. These early believers would go to the synagogue on Saturday, the Sabbath, but then they added something new. They started meeting together at dawn on Sunday, the day of the resurrection, for a uniquely Christian celebration, the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist. This single act became this incredibly important defining part of their new identity. Okay, so let's really dive into this. Let's paint a picture. Imagine you could walk into one of these homes in, say, the 1st or 2nd century. What would you actually see? What would you hear?
The book of Acts gives us a pretty good roadmap. It says they devoted themselves to a few key things. First, there was teaching, straight from the accounts of the apostles. Then there was fellowship, just encouraging each other, living life together. And right at the center of it all was a shared meal, sometimes called a love feast, which would include the breaking of bread, that sacred ritual of communion. And all of this was woven together with scripture readings, singing, and prayer. It was spiritual for sure, but it was also deeply, deeply social.
Now, of course, things weren't always that simple. This couldn't always happen out in the open. As persecution from the Roman authorities started to ramp up, these communities had to be incredibly adaptable. Meetings moved from the comfort of a home to literally anywhere they could find safety, sometimes hiding out in caves or even in the catacombs beneath a city, surrounded by their dead. Their commitment to meeting together was just incredible.
So you might be wondering, how do we know all these details? Is this just guesswork? Well, no, not at all. We actually have this remarkably clear snapshot of what one of these services looked like thanks to a writer named Justin Martyr. Around the year 150, he wrote a letter to the Roman emperor describing a typical Christian gathering, and it gives us this amazing window into their world.
And when you look at what he described, you see that even in someone's home, there was a real rhythm to it. They'd start with scripture, reading from the Gospels or the Old Testament prophets. Then the leader would give a sermon, kind of breaking it down for everyone. After that, the whole community would stand up and pray together before moving to the main event, the Eucharist. And check out that last step. Deacons would even take the bread and wine to people who couldn't be there. That just shows you how vital it was to make sure the entire community was included.
But here's the thing, if we only focus on the order of service, we're totally missing the bigger picture. We're missing the most important point. These gatherings were so much more than a weekly ritual. They were the absolute lifeline of a radical, brand new kind of community.
I mean, you have to stop and think about just how absolutely revolutionary this was. In the Roman Empire, society was built on these rigid social hierarchies. But this idea, captured right here by the Apostle Paul, was being put into actual practice.
In that house church, a slave could be sitting right next to their master, a Roman citizen next to a foreigner, a man next to a woman, and they were all seen as equals. It was a profound social statement.
And this wasn't just some nice idea they talked about, they actually lived it in really tangible, practical ways. We read about them selling their possessions to give to anyone in need. Justin Martyr himself mentioned that at every single service a collection was taken to care for the most vulnerable, orphans, widows, the sick, and even those in prison. Hospitality wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was an absolutely essential part of their identity.
And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? For them, church wasn't a thing that happened for an hour on a Sunday. It was an everyday reality of mutual support, shared resources, and a shared life. It was about being the church all the time, together.
Okay, so if this intimate, home-based model was the way things were done for centuries, what happened? How did we get from a shared meal in a living room to the huge cathedrals and formal church buildings we see today?
Well, you can kind of see the whole journey right here. For the first 300 years, the house church was the standard, both for practical reasons and, because of that constant threat of persecution. But the huge turning point came in the 4th century, when Christianity was finally legalized in the Roman Empire. Everything changed. Believers could finally meet in public without fear, and as the community exploded in size, they began to construct the very first dedicated buildings for worship.
So when you peel it all back, you're left with this really powerful question. The early church, it was defined not by its architecture but by its radical community, its generosity, its shared life. It was about people, not places. And that really makes you wonder, what is the true essence of church for us today? That's something we're thinking about.